Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Swan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in South African tax. Now this episode will be released on Boxing Day, so as you can see I'm still in my t-shirt, so it's still holiday. So if you're starting to crave something that resembles work, hopefully this short episode of the podcast would be that. Our topic for today has got nothing to do with the festive season. We're talking about tax allowances on solar assets. Quite a few people asked me for a podcast about this, and Sash recently issued a guide on it as well. So I thought it would be a good time to speak about it. If we want to really stretch the link to Christmas, maybe you can see the incentive as some sort of a gift from the government that we're talking about. But I think that's pushing it. Right. Let's start. What do we have as far as solar energy assets is concerned at the moment? We've got a permanent allowance that we've got in Section 12B of the Income Tax Act. Then we've got a temporary allowance, an enhanced allowance that's in Section 12BA of the Income Tax Act. We also had an incentive for solar panels for individuals in Section 6 Cap C, but that's expired, so we're not going to talk about that. And then on the other end of the scale, we've got deductions for certain infrastructure costs on larger projects in Section 12U that we're also not going to discuss today. So what I would like to focus on is just to highlight a few key features of these incentives for solar energy assets. So let's start with the permanent incentive, Section 12B. So it starts off by saying that if we're looking at what qualifies for the allowance, we're looking at machinery, plant, implements, utensils, or articles. So any of these items, that item must be owned by the taxpayer or acquired in terms of an installment sales agreement or an installment credit agreement as defined in the VAT Act. It must be brought into use for the first time by this specific taxpayer, so it can't be an asset that you previously used, disposed of, and now reacquired to start using it. And then the key requirement here, the taxpayer must bring it into use for purposes of his or her trade to be used by that taxpayer in the generation of electricity from photovoltaic solar energy. So that's the key requirement, that you must use the asset in the generation of electricity. So if we look at the commentary that SARS has got in their guide on this, if we look at something like a solar geyser, although it's using solar technology and solar energy, it's using it to heat water. It's not generating electricity. So that asset doesn't qualify. SARS then goes on to say that because the legislation talks about the asset must be used or the item must be used in the generation of electricity, it's not limited to only those assets that produce the electricity. The fact that the word in means that you need to look at it a bit more widely. So they then say that there's a clear distinguishment between assets that produce or generate electricity, assets that store electricity, and assets that are used to transmit electricity. So what the incentive primarily, or the allowance primarily focuses on, is those assets that produce electricity. But SARS then goes on to say that if you look at a storage asset like a battery, or a transmission asset like a transformer or cabling, if those assets form an integral part of the system that generates the electricity from solar energy, then these assets all qualify. So if you've got a battery that charges from the Eskom grid, that battery doesn't qualify because it's not an integral part of the system that generates this or electricity from solar energy. But if it's part of the system, then the battery can qualify. The same on the transmission assets. Then the allowance goes on to say it also includes or applies to structures and foundations if they meet the requirements specified in the legislation. And then the legislation makes a distinction between systems that are bigger than 1 megawatt and systems that are smaller than 1 megawatt. So the systems that are smaller than 1 megawatt qualify for 100% allowance in the year in which they are brought into use. The bigger systems, more than 1 megawatt, would qualify for a 50-30-20 allowance. So that's in a nutshell some of the key elements of the permanent allowance. Then we move on to the enhanced allowance, section 12BA. What the enhancement that it gives 125% allowance on these assets when they are brought into use, irrespective of their size. There's a few differences between this provision and the permanent one. The enhanced allowance requires that the assets must be new and unused. What it also does is it makes it a bit clearer that it's also intended to apply where the assets are used by a lessee in the generation of electricity. What you must, however, bear in mind is that if the assets are owned, the items are owned by the lessor and they are being used by the lessee, section 23 capital A is very likely to apply, and that would limit the allowances, or when the lessor can claim the allowances. Then the last important point about the enhanced incentive I would like to highlight is that it only applies to assets brought into use before or on 28 February 2025. So there's about another 2 months or so that this enhanced incentive would run. Then we go back to the permanent allowance that exists. The last point I would like to touch on is that there's a lot of, let's call it, investment products that are marketed using section 12B, where you can invest in a solar asset through an in-common-deed partnership structure. So I've had a lot of emails from people asking whether, is this legit, can this be right? Now, SARS refers to these structures in their guide, and they also refer to some related rulings that were issued. So I think that confirms that in principle the structure is something that can work. But as with all these things, the devil is in the detail. So you would have to look very carefully as to how the structure was put into place, and what the allowances are that would flow through to an investor. But that's a bit beyond our discussion for today. So in closing, I think let's just recap. There's an enhanced incentive, section 12BA, that's coming to an end. But section 12B, the permanent allowance, continues. And the second point to take home is, as with any incentive, there's detailed requirements to be considered and satisfied before you can claim this deduction. That's it for today's episode. As always, if you've liked the episode, please like it on Google Podcasts. The podcast is now available on the Google platform. And go and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Then you'll get a notification whenever there's a new episode. Also, please tell all your friends and colleagues about it. That's the only way we can grow the listener base. And if you've got any ideas or feedback, I would appreciate if you send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. Lastly, as always, I would just like to remind you that the podcast is only for information purposes. It's not intended to be tax advice or even a replacement for fact-specific tax advice. Until next time, enjoy the holidays. Goodbye.